My name is Chris Reed. If you're a guest and it's your first time here, I'm the Director of Biblical Education, and I get the opportunity to share from time to time. And I get the opportunity today to continue us in the series that we're in called Build Your House. And we are talking about the idea of building our house on a firm foundation. And it's based out of one of Jesus' most famous discourses, one of his most famous sermons, which we typically know as the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is essentially the different principles, the different values, the different precepts that Jesus puts in place so that his disciples would know what discipleship looks like. These are the things that we're striving to live out in our lives as we claim to be followers of Jesus. And so this sermon is to teach, it's to instruct and to show disciples the way. And what he says to them is if you put these things into practice, you will endure the storms that come your way. And now the promise that Jesus is not making is that you won't feel the pressure of the storm. The promise that Jesus is not making is that you won't experience any storms. So he's not going to necessarily take the storms away, and he's not necessarily going to make them so that we kind of float above them. But what he says is for those who anchor their lives to me, to Jesus, they will survive the storms that come their way. And at the Reed House, wintertime is an eventful thing. You see, in the wintertime, we sit up on a hill. We don't just sit up on a hill in the wintertime. We sit up on a hill, our house does, all the time. But in the wintertime, the wind comes from the northwest. And the wind gets fierce. Last night, the wind was absolutely terrible. We could hear it. It like rattles our windows. It blows so hard. As a matter of fact, it's taken grills clean off the deck. I came home one time and found our glass picnic table upended in the yard and shattered from the wind. Storms that have come through. But you know what doesn't blow away and doesn't move? The trampoline that I've got 4-foot long rebar candy cane and driven into the ground so that thing doesn't blow away. It's anchored to the ground, right? Our roof doesn't blow off because Jeff Miller, when we were building our house, handed me these things, these spikes that were about this long, and they're called truss anchors. And he made me go through and put one into every single truss. And what did it do? It anchored the roof of our house to the rest of our house. And the same thing for the foundation. Our house is anchored to the foundation. And so this is what Jesus is saying. The things that are tethered to him, the people that are tethered to him, the lives that are tethered to him are able to endure whatever comes their way. And we've talked about storms that come from outside of us. They come from something else or someone else that created. Think illnesses that we have no control over. We've eaten vegetables our entire lives. We've run thousands of miles, and yet we still get sick. We work hard. We're good employees, and yet the economy takes a downturn, and we lose our jobs. These are the circumstances that are really outside of our control that show up, and we really just have no say in whether or not they come at us or not. Then there are the storms that we've created by our own choices. And we've talked about this a little bit, where our decisions lead us into a storm in life, a moment of tension, a moment of struggle and trial. When we overspend our budget, that's a choice that we make that brings us into a storm. If we neglect our relationships and our relationships fall apart, that's a storm based off our own choices. Well, today I want to talk about a different type of storm. I want to talk about the storms that are created by trying to follow Jesus and living out his ways. And maybe that shocks you that I just said that. Are you undoing everything that we just talked about the last 14 weeks? I thought you said that the ways of Jesus, the ways that he calls us to, that those things would anchor us and that those things would make our lives better. And what I'm not saying is that Jesus is pulling the wool over our eyes. I'm not saying that he's done a bait and switch. And I'm not saying that the ways of Jesus are not better. But Jesus, when he calls us to do these things, he is doing nothing short but upending our lives. Let's take a look at the things that he tells us to do. He says, be a type of person who fights for good in the world. This is what he said in Matthew chapter 5. Be better than the best religious person you know. He says, do not feed anger. Do not feed lust. He says, live in a way that avoids burning bridges as long as you're able to. He says, be honest and straightforward. He says, do not try to get even. Instead, do good to those who hurt you. He says, love your enemies. He says, do religious practices, but do them in a way that is for the sole purpose of honoring God. He says, do not overly invest your time, your money, and your energy into earthly treasures, but instead value God's kingdom over your own. He says, don't worry, be happy. No, that was not Jesus. He just says, don't worry. He says, do not condemn others, but give them the benefit of the doubt. Looking at this list, can we see some potential storms, some struggle, some trial, right? Can we see that these things might be difficult? How many of you have been trying to put these things into practice in your life? You can go ahead and raise your hand. Oh, I wish there was more. There should be more of you. All of you should be raising your hand. How many of you have discovered that these things are oftentimes difficult, right? Why is that? Well, the reason that these good things create storms in our lives is because, for one, we live in a culture that is the opposite of this. I mean, think about it. Jesus tells us not to be angry, but every headline in the news is bent for one purpose, to get you to click on it. And how do they do that? They do that by giving you the most contentious, angry thing that they possibly can give you. Think about the advertisements and the entertainment that we look at and that we watch. Is it not saturated with lustful images? I mean, the whole idea of advertisement is lust. It may not be after something sexual, but it's lust after something, right? Every movie that's worth its salt is a revenge movie. Matthew liked that joke. He knows the type of movies that I love. Just so you know, I don't endorse this movie, but I'm just saying, John Wick 4 is coming out. Might be one of my favorite movies. I've not seen that one, but the other three were great. It's a revenge movie. And so we're fed this stuff. I'm joking, but to be honest, like, Jesus says don't get even, and yet it feels good to get revenge. And the reality is that we live amongst people that don't adhere to this way of living. And it creates tension in our lives. But we don't even have to look outside of ourselves, really, to understand that this is at times a storm for us. Our own desires betray us. Even though we desire to follow after Jesus, our own desires still want the things that are opposite of this sometimes. Isn't it easier to stay quiet than to do the right thing? Doesn't doing the right thing at times take you out of your comfort zone, that it might cost you something to speak up when somebody's doing something wrong at work? When a friend is going down a bad path and you're more afraid of losing the friendship than you are speaking truth and life to that person? Don't we justify lust, overspending? Why? Because it doesn't hurt anybody else, right? It's not really that bad. Don't we justify valuing our possessions over other people and over the kingdom of God? Because honestly, didn't we work for it? Isn't it ours? Don't we deserve it? So you get this, right? You get this sense that the things of following after Jesus, of doing the things that he calls us to, can at times be difficult. And if it's not, C.S. Lewis would say that you're doing it wrong, that you're not really pursuing this, because he says that that the only way that we know the full weight of what Jesus says is by actually giving ourselves to it. He says, when you try to do something good and opposition comes against you, that's when you know that you're walking this out, that it's difficult. And so we face this storms that are caused by us trying to find the storm-proof life. And I know my MO, my thought process in this, as I've approached each of these is maybe I can fix this. Maybe I can just get better and get over these trials and these struggles with this. Maybe it takes more discipline, and maybe I need to be better motivated, or maybe I need to be better at starting, and maybe I can get this finally under control one day. And maybe one day my life will be storm-proof. But that's not what really we're invited to. And I know that our culture, it celebrates the self-starter. It celebrates the self-motivator, the self-disciplined person, because that is the way that we find success in almost every other area of our lives. But it's not the way that Jesus operated. It's not the way that Jesus lived his life. It's not the way that Jesus fulfilled his calling and lived out his ministry. You see, the things that Jesus did, what Jesus went to, and how he operated was something different than the way that we approach it at times. Jesus modeled not self-independence. He didn't model his own strength. What he modeled was a dependence on God. What he modeled was a life that looked to God and sought after God in every single avenue of what he was doing. He would disappear at times, and he would go, and the disciples would ask him, where were you? And he would tell them, I'm off seeking God. And so when the God of the universe, Jesus, God in the flesh, he comes and he becomes a man, and he lives his life in such a way that he is dependent on God, why do we think that we can do it any different way? You see, I've been a Christian I'm not good with math. I grew up in the church. I got saved it was 1998. I've been thinking about God things for almost my entire life. Became a pastor in 2010. And you want to know how many of these things that I have nailed down? Right? I'm still working at it. And what God is teaching me and what God is showing me is what Jesus did. Jesus didn't even try to operate in these things out of his own power and his own strength. He always went to God. This is what it says in John chapter 5, verse 19. This is what John wrote about his friend Jesus. He says, so Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. Jesus relied on God to prepare his way. Jesus relied on God to give him direction and wisdom. Jesus relied on God to give him strength. And at any moment of need, anytime a storm arose, anytime something got difficult, Jesus knew that all he had to do was turn to God, and that God would come through for him. See, what Jesus modeled for the life of the disciple is that the life that endures its storms is a life that learns to seek and depend on God. And so that's why 3/4 of the way into the sermon on how to be a disciple, 3/4 of the way into his message on how they should live and how they should act, he goes to a passage where he talks about depending on God. So turn with me to Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to pick up in verse 7. Verse 7 says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. And what's implied here, what's implied here is prayer. The idea of seeking after God, and that is the method that God has given us to come to him, is to come and to pray to him. We also know this because in Luke, when Luke writes these verses down, he includes them with the Lord's Prayer. And so we get context that what Jesus is calling us to do is to come to God in prayer. And he gives 3 commands here. These are, I don't know if you know what imperatives are, but an imperative is something where someone is telling you that this is what you should do. And he gives 3 commands. He says, ask, seek, and knock. Jesus tells his disciples, if you want to live this storm-proof life, ask, seek, and knock. You're going to have to pursue God in prayer. And what's crazy is that while all 3 of these are commands, they all command a submissive posture. You see, the picture that Jesus gives is one of a dependent reaching out to someone in a stronger position to request something from them. You see, how many of us in our lives would we say that we're omniscient or all-knowing? I'll go that direction. How many would say that we know the future? That we're able to know what's around the next corner? How many of us would say that we're all powerful? Nobody, right? How many of us would say that we have a pure heart and that we're always able to respond in the right way? No. But who is the one that can teach us? Who is the one that's all-knowing? Who is the one that's all-powerful? God, right? And so when we come to God, as we're commanded to come to God and seek him, we are going to him and we are searching out someone who can move in our situation. So if we're lacking wisdom, he can give it. If we need strength, he can give it. If we're unsure which direction to go, he is able to give it. My kids from time to time, more often than not, they come to me and they say, Dad, can I have some money? In that moment, they are coming and they are asking me for something because they do not have jobs and they are dependent on me to provide for them. Their social life has gotten really expensive. I'll just let you know that. But they come to me because they believe and they trust that I can provide for them. They are dependent, looking for help in a moment of need. So when we see that we're in situations, when being a disciple brings us to a place in which we have a need and we see that we see a storm brewing, Jesus commands us to make a request or to make our request known to God. Now, that may sound contrary to what he told us in Matthew chapter 6, verse 8. He says, do not be like the Gentiles, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Okay, so is he contradicting himself here a few chapters later? Well, no. Is he like determined? Like, is it just kind of a hoop that he calls us to jump through? I really want you just to come and ask. It really doesn't do anything. No. James, Jesus' brother, reflects on this teaching later and he says, you do not have because you do not ask. And so there's this idea that we need to come to God and we need to present our request. We need to present our need to God because it makes a difference. And Jesus' conviction comes from the stories of the Old Testament. Stories like Moses intervening so that God doesn't wipe his people off the face of the earth. Or stories like the Ninevites repenting and God relenting of his wrath against them because they were wicked people. Prayers were made. God heard them. And he moved. Going back to the story of my kids and money. They know that I will provide for them. And so they come to me and they ask, would I give them money if they didn't ask? Probably not. Is it because I don't love them? No. Is it because I'm not able to provide for them? No. But what I want when they come and ask are two things. I want them to recognize that they're dependent. I want them to see their need. But I also want them to connect with me relationally. I want them to know that when they have a need, when they feel overwhelmed, when they feel like they have a lack, that I can be the one that provides for them. And so in humility, we go to God and we ask God and we wait for him to move in our situation and we ask him. We say, God, I'm being tempted right now. God, will you help me? I need wisdom. God, will you help me navigate this situation? I need provision. I want to be faithful to you in my finances. Will you provide if I do? And in these moments, what we're doing is the storms that's created, the tension that we feel from being obedient to God, we're able to go to him and say, God, this makes a lack in my life. Will you fill that gap? And it teaches us to trust him. So Jesus commands us to ask and bring our needs and our requests to God. But that command comes with a promise. Jesus promises that God will hear and respond. These things that he says, ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. Those are conditional statements, meaning that if you ask, it will be given. If you seek, it will be found. And now, when we read that, it can be tempting to think that what God is saying, or what Jesus is saying in this moment, is that God is a genie. That all we need to do is go and ask. And if we just ask him for what we want, he'll provide. Almost like how many of you seen the movie Bruce Almighty? It's a terrible movie. But I've seen it. And there's a scene in there where Bruce is getting all the prayers in, and he doesn't know how to handle them, so he makes all the prayers into an email form. And all these people are asking these requests, praying to God for the things that they want. And Bruce gets tired of it, and he just goes, yes, reply all. And what happens in that movie? Chaos ensues, right? You see, God doesn't say yes to everybody, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't hear and that he doesn't respond. You see, this promise, the promise that God hears and God responds, is a promise that prayer works. That it's worth your time and your effort to bring your requests to God. I had a season of this not too long, it's been years ago now at this point, where I just felt like, man, my prayers are just smacking the ceiling. I don't know what's going on. I'm just keep running into things. Like God's not answering. I say the same prayers over and over again. He's just not, I don't even know if he hears me. And I remember one day I was driving to Starbucks. And as I was getting to Starbucks, I was just thinking to myself, I was like, man, I don't know. I've never had anybody pay for my drink. I don't know that I've ever experienced that. I've done it for a lot of people in the past, but God, I don't know if that even happens. And this was in the same season that I'm going, God, I don't know that you hear my prayers. I pull up to the Starbucks window. I go to pay for my drink. That very time in the car. And the lady goes, your Starbucks order has been paid for. Have a good day. That moment was a moment for me that confirmed in my heart that not that God gives me what I want, because that's a simple thing. It's a moment where God confirms in my heart that prayer works, that we can bring our needs and our requests to God, and that he does hear us. Picking up in verse 8, he says, for everyone who, you see, Jesus invites everyone to go to him. This is not something that pastors can do. My drink didn't get paid for. God didn't answer my prayer because I'm a pastor. This isn't what the professionals do. And there was a thought process in Judaism that only like super prayers could be the ones who get their prayers heard and get their prayers answered. People like Elijah, people like Moses. But Jesus comes and he says, no. He says, everyone can come to the Father in their moment of need. Everyone can cry out to him. And everyone can expect that God will hear them and respond. You see, that was one of the things that Jesus was doing. He was making a way for not just the professionals, not just the religious, but that all that would come to God would be able to draw near to him. And this is what Hebrews says that Jesus did for us. In Hebrews 4:16, it says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And so what does that mean? That means that though other people can pray for us, though it's good to have others pray with us for things, we can take responsibility for our needs in ourselves and go to God and say, God, I need this. I need you to move in my relationship with my spouse. I need you to move in my finances. I need you to help me overcome this temptation. And God hears. And if you're not quite sure like how to go about this, Matthew taught a great message on the Lord's Prayer a few weeks back, where he talked about it being the framework for our prayer life. And it really helps give structure to our prayer time. If you're not sure where to start with even that, we produce a daily devotional every single day that you can go to. There's a prayer on the end of it. That is there not to just give you a prayer to read, but to teach you how to pray. So utilize these tools, because God doesn't want to have you just come to professional prayers. He wants to hear from you. Going on. He says, for everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks it will be opened. And the idea here is that this is repeated action. This is the Chris Reed translation. For everyone repeatedly asking receives, and the one repeatedly seeking discovers, and the one repeatedly knocking, it will be opened. Jesus tells us to come and ask as much as we need. You see, God never grows tired, and he never grows weary, and he never grows less the rich. He never grows lesser in his abundance when we have to come back to him time and time again. Your neediness does not a bother to God. He wants you to bring your needs every single time you have them. My kids come to me and ask for money a lot. It wears me out sometimes, but I'm not God. God could give you $1 million a day, and he would not be the less for it. Don't ask, because it's probably not going to happen. Or ask and see what happens. But God is unlimited in his patience. He's unlimited in his kindness. He's unlimited in his mercy. And so as you look to become a disciple and you try to put these things into practice and you struggle and you fail, Jesus says, come to the Father. Ask him for help. Ask him to help you in your time of need. He will not reject you in that. And finishing off the verses, Jesus really gets to the center, the heart of this. He says, or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, will give him a serpent? If you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask? You see, when we ask, seek, and knock, Jesus promises that that what God gives will be good. And when we hear this, it can be tempting to think that it's the Bruce Almighty, the reply all, that God's going to give us whatever we want. But that's that's not really the way that he operates. It's that everything that he gives us will be for our good. And it's not wrong to have desires and to bring those desires to God. But that's why we ask. That's why we take a posture of submission. We bring our desires and we surrender them, knowing and trusting that even if God says no in those situations, in those circumstances, in those desires, he will say yes to something good. He will give us what we need. Because here's the thing, and this is the ultimate good, that God would make us like his son. That God would have us implement his vision for what life, the storm-proof life, should look like. And so he is not going to withhold anything that would help us with that. And I love how Luke kind of shifts this passage a little bit. This is what it says in Luke chapter 11, verse 13. Same section of scripture. He says, if you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will the Heavenly Father give you the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? You see, who is the Holy Spirit but God in you and with you wherever you go, with the same powers, with the same foresight, with the same knowledge, with the same heart of Christ, with the same intentions to see you be faithful in your life as you pursue Jesus, for you to endure the storms. And he is right there with you and in you, so that at any moment, at any time, in every way, you can come to God, you can seek God, and you can say, I'm in desperate need of you right now. And he will be with you in that moment. And he will hear you. And he will come through for you. You see, this was the key to Jesus' faithfulness. The belief that God is good and that he loves you, that he loved him. It's what allowed Jesus to go into the garden and say, God, I don't want to go to the cross, but I believe with everything that is in me that if you don't give me this desire right here, that you are good. And he remained faithful to God in that. And if we want to be disciples and we want to put into practice the things that we had on the screen, and we want to live this storm-proof life, we are going to have to learn the way of Jesus when it comes to seeking the Father. Because the life that will endure its storms is the life that seeks and depends on the God who loves you and desires nothing more than you to be made in his son's likeness. So we're gonna take some time and we're gonna practice this. The band's gonna come out and they're just gonna play. Asking, seeking, knocking is praying. And so you're gonna have time here today just to take whatever it is the needs in your heart are to God. For those of you that have been trying to pursue this way and you found it difficult and you found it trying, it's a perfect opportunity to come to God and go, God, I'm struggling with this. I need you to move. I need your help. Some of you need healing. It's the perfect opportunity to come to God and say, God, I need you to heal me. Some of you need freedom from addictions and from sins, and it's a perfect opportunity to come and say, God, help me. And so we're gonna take time to reflect. And then we're gonna stand and we're gonna worship together. Let's pray. God, we come to this moment. We come to this time now seeking, expecting, and anticipating that you are able to fill our needs. That whatever we face in life, whatever we need in life, God, we can bring those needs to you. But particularly as we try to live out the calling that you've put on us, as we try to be disciples, as we try to follow your ways and we try to implement the things that you've called us to that we know are good for us and yet are hard for us. We surrender those things to you, and we ask you that your Holy Spirit would fill us, that you would empower us, and that you would make us able to stay faithful to you and to follow your ways. And it's in your precious name we pray. Amen.